Rain came down that night the way God himself was grieving. It came in great, heavy sheets against the tall windows of Sterling Court, drumming the stone walls, drowning the sound of the horses in the yard, drowning the sound of everything, everything except one voice. A woman's voice. Lady Josephine Winthrop Sterling stood in the center of her husband's study, her dark hair unraveling from its pins, her forest green gown soaked through from where she had rushed across the corridor in the storm. She was not supposed to be out of bed. Her physician had warned against it. But when a maid had come running to her chamber, with trembling hands and a face full of fear, Josephine had not stayed still. She never could when it came to the man she loved. Duke Sebastian Sterling stood at the far end of the room, his broad back turned to her, firelight carving shadows along the line of his jaw. He was still, terrifyingly still, the kind of stillness that has already decided something. In his hand were letters. Josephine could see the pale parchment from where she stood. She had never seen those letters before in her life, and yet they bore her seal. Sebastian, he did not turn. Those letters are not mine. Whatever has been shown to you, whatever you have been told tonight, I am asking you to hear me. He turned slowly, and when his grey-blue eyes found hers, Josephine felt something cold move through her, not from the rain still damp on her skin, but from the look on his face. There was no anger in it. Anger she could have fought. What looked back at her was something worse. Judgment. Behind him, near the bookshelves, stood Dowager Duchess Vivienne Sterling, Sebastian's mother, perfectly composed in her violet evening gown, pearls at her throat, hands folded, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose plan had worked exactly as she intended. "You deny these letters," Sebastian said. His voice was low and controlled, the way a man speaks when he has decided to feel nothing. "I deny them completely. Sebastian, someone has forged my hand. Someone placed that necklace in my room. I discovered something about the mill workers' funds, and someone did not want me to speak." Vivienne smiled, faintly, just enough for Josephine to see it. "My dear," Vivienne said, her voice like warmed silk, "the letters are in your hand, sealed with your ring, and the necklace was found behind your writing desk. What kind of innocent woman needs this many explanations?" Josephine looked back at her husband. She looked at the man who had stood with her at the altar, the man who had once pressed his forehead to hers in the garden and promised she would never face the world alone. She placed one hand over her abdomen. "Sebastian, I am carrying your child." The room fell so quiet that the rain seemed to grow louder. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. And for one single, terrible moment, something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked like it might reach for her, might step forward, might choose love over pride. But Vivienne spoke first, and how convenient that she mentions this now. Sebastian looked away. He stepped back. Before the clock in the hallway struck midnight, the great doors of Sterling Court opened. No carriage was called. No servant was sent ahead. Lady Josephine Winthrop Sterling walked out into the rain with one small bag in her hand, one shawl around her shoulders, and one hand pressed against the child, who had not yet been given the chance to know his father. She did not look back, and the doors closed behind her. 5 years later, on a grey morning in the forgotten coastal village of Westmere Cove, a small boy with muddy boots and torn sleeves stood in the middle of the road and refused to move out of the way of a duke's carriage. When the duke stepped out to scold him, the boy looked up, and Duke Sebastian Sterling stared into the exact grey-blue eyes he saw every morning in his own mirror. The truth had not died in the rain. It had grown, and it was coming for everything he thought he still owned. Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this day finds you well and in excellent spirits, as we journey toward the grand milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support means more than words can properly express. If tales of courage, injustice, hidden truth, and love that arrives in the most unexpected hour speak to your heart, be sure to subscribe. leave a like upon this video and join the growing court of loyal viewers who gather here. Before we continue, we would love to know, from which corner of the world do you watch? And what hour does the clock strike in your land at this very moment? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every single one of you is seen, and every one is welcome here. Now, without further delay, let us return to our story. 3 days before that terrible night, Josephine had made a discovery that was never meant to be hers. She had been sorting correspondence in the estate office, a small act of diligence she often performed on days when Sebastian was away in the city, when a sealed ledger had slipped from behind the cabinet and fallen open at her feet. The numbers inside did not match, not by a small margin, by thousands. Money set aside for the Sterling mill workers, wages owed, medical provisions promised, coal funds pledged to families surviving the worst winter Westmere County had seen in a generation, had been quietly redirected. The entries were careful, the handwriting deliberate, the false names convincing. But Josephine had spent 2 years quietly learning estate accounts because she wanted to be useful, not decorative, and she knew what she was reading. She had sat with that ledger for a long time. Then she had written to Mr. Rupert Blackwell, the family solicitor, and asked him to come at his earliest convenience on a matter of some urgency. She had told no one else. She had not yet suspected that someone already knew. 3 nights later, the letters appeared. The study door had been open when Sebastian's personal attendant, Graves, had brought the package to him. A sealed collection of letters, allegedly recovered from a trusted source, detailing a private arrangement between Lady Josephine Sterling and a French correspondent named Monsieur Aldrich Fontaine. The letters described meetings at a riverside lodge during Sebastian's parliamentary sessions. They described affection. They described plans. They were written in Josephine's handwriting. They bore her wax seal, the small dove she had used since girlhood. Sebastian had read them once and set them down, and sat in silence for a long time. That was when Vivienne had come in. She always seemed to arrive at precisely the right moment for someone else's ruin. "I did not wish to show you these," she had said, her voice full of rehearsed sorrow. "I hoped there was an explanation. But the necklace was found this morning, Sebastian. Your grandmother's necklace. The one you gave Josephine on her first birthday here. It was found in a second package, sent back, as though she no longer needed it. By the time Josephine arrived, the verdict had already been quietly delivered. She simply had not been informed of it yet. She argued with precision. She named the date, the fever, the physician who had attended her. She asked Sebastian to look at the seal. The dove impression was slightly tilted, the wax color a shade lighter than her own stock. She asked him to send for Clara, her maid, who could confirm her whereabouts on the dates in question. Sebastian did not send for Clara. Vivienne answered every point before he could think it through himself. And Sebastian, proud, honorable, deeply afraid of being made to look foolish in front of the world he had been raised to command, chose the version of the story that required him to feel betrayed, rather than the one that required him to look closer. It is easier to cast someone out than to admit you were nearly made a fool. And so he did. Clara Pembroke stood in the servants' corridor and watched the whole thing happen and could not stop any of it. She had been Josephine's lady's maid for 4 years. She knew her mistress's handwriting the way a musician knows their own instrument. Every loop, every tilt, every particular pressure of the pen. Those letters were wrong. She knew it from the first line she had glimpsed over Mr. Graves' shoulder. The dove seal was wrong. The dates were wrong. But Clara had also, 2 nights before, received a visit from one of Vivienne's personal footmen. The message had not been delivered in words. It had been delivered in the way the man had stood in her doorway, blocking the light, and told her that service at Sterling Court was a privilege that could be revoked. She was 22 years old. She had a younger brother in an apprenticeship that the Sterling estate funded. She said nothing. She stood in the corridor and watched Lady Josephine walk down the great staircase with one small traveling bag, her back straight, her face wet. not with rain yet, but with tears she refused to wipe away, as though doing so might give someone the satisfaction of knowing they had caused them. As Josephine passed, Clara stepped forward. Quickly, silently, she pressed a small purse of coins into the bag, along with a folded shawl and a note that said nothing except, "I know the truth. I am sorry. Forgive me." Josephine paused. She turned and looked at Clara for just a moment. She did not speak, but the look she gave was not one of anger. It was one of understanding. And then the doors opened, and the rain swallowed her whole. Josephine walked for 3 hours in that storm. She had no carriage. She had very little money. She had a child shifting inside her, and a body already weakened from weeks of careful rest that she had now completely undone. But she kept walking, one hand pressed to her side, because the alternative was to stop, and if she stopped, the grief would catch her. She could not let it catch her, not yet, not until she had made it somewhere safe. "I will not let fear raise this child," she told herself, teeth pressed together against the cold. "Courage, will, whatever I have left of it." By morning, she had found a coaching inn at the edge of a village called Ridgemore. She paid for one night with Clara's coins, gave her name as Joanna Wells, and slept with her hand pressed flat against her unborn child until the sun came up pale and cold over the hills. She did not cry until the innkeeper's wife brought her a bowl of porridge and a kind word without being asked. Sometimes it is a stranger's small kindness that finally breaks you open.
Josephine arrived in Westmere Cove 11 days after leaving Stirling Court. She arrived on foot, with a bag that had grown lighter and shoes that had grown thinner, and she arrived in the middle of the village's weekly market, which meant that approximately 47 people witnessed her arrival and formed approximately 47 immediate opinions about who she was and whether she was trouble. Mr. Percy Bramble, the village baker, formed his opinion within the first 30 seconds. "Lost, cold, and very pregnant," he announced to no one in particular, wrapping a fresh loaf in cloth and pressing it into her hands before she had said a single word. The best things that ever came to Westmere Cove arrived exactly like this. "If you're a tax collector, I retract everything." Josephine, who had not eaten since the previous morning, held the bread and laughed, a short, exhausted, genuinely surprised sound that she had not expected to come out of her. It was the first time she had laughed since the night of the rain. Mrs. Margaret Holloway found her an hour later, sitting on the stone steps of the old chapel, with the bread half eaten and her eyes finally closed. Margaret was a widow of 53 years, a former schoolmistress whose husband had left her with a cottage, a sharp mind, and absolutely no patience for suffering that could be prevented. She asked Josephine 3 questions. Did she have anywhere to sleep? Did she have a physician? Did anyone know where she was? When all 3 answers were no, Margaret picked up the bag from beside her and said, "Then you are coming home with me, and we will sort out the rest in the morning." That was how it began. Josephine spent the first weeks resting under Margaret's firm and entirely non-negotiable care. She helped with small things, mending, reading to the children Margaret still tutored informally, writing letters for villagers who needed help with words. Word spread that the quiet woman at the schoolmistress's cottage had a fine hand and a willing manner, and Westmere Cove, which was a village that had learned to take people as they came, absorbed her without ceremony. She did not speak of Stirling Court. She did not speak of Sebastian. She gave herself the name Joanna Wells, and she kept it, and the village kept it with her. What Josephine did not know, what none of them yet knew, was that the funds missing from the Sterling estate accounts had been quietly funneled into properties along the coast, properties that included a small interest in a disused mill in Westmere Cove itself, which meant that someday, not yet, but someday, that village and that name would draw someone back to find her. Not yet.
The storm that brought Arthur Sterling into the world was almost as violent as the one that had taken his mother out of her home. It arrived without warning in the last week of October, rolling in off the coast in the early hours of the morning, and Josephine woke to the sound of the sea hammering the rocks below the village, and to a pain in her back that told her the child had decided, quite firmly, that he was done waiting. Margaret sent Percy Bramble to fetch Dr. Aldous Crane, the village physician, a steady man of 60 who had delivered half of Westmere Cove and was not easily rattled, and then rolled up her sleeves and told Josephine to breathe. "I am breathing," Josephine said, through her teeth. "Breathe slower. Panicking costs energy, and you'll need every bit of it." "I am not panicking. I am managing." "Yes, you are. Magnificently. Now breathe." Arthur was born at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning, during a crack of lightning that lit the whole cottage white. He arrived in the world the way he would navigate it, loudly, immediately, with his fists already clenched. Margaret wrapped him and placed him in Josephine's arms. Josephine looked down at the red, furious, extraordinary little face of her son, and then his eyes opened, grey-blue, clear and steady as a winter sky, the exact eyes of Duke Sebastian Sterling. Josephine did not cry. She had made a promise to herself somewhere in the long walking dark of those 11 days from Sterling Court to here, that she would not raise this child in grief or bitterness, that she would not teach him his father was the enemy, because a child taught to hate half of himself learns only to be divided. She would teach him instead that he was loved, wholly, by the parent who stayed. She kissed his forehead. "Your name is Arthur," she told him, "and you are entirely mine, and entirely brave, and entirely enough." He looked up at her with those impossible eyes, as though he understood every word. He probably did. He was, after all, a Sterling. Arthur Sterling, known to Westmere Cove as Arthur Wells, grew into the most relentlessly curious child the village had ever produced. He asked questions from the moment he could form them. Why was the tide different every day? Why did bread rise? Why did the old widow on Harbour Lane keep 3 cats, but insist she disliked animals? Why did his mother sometimes look at the sea with a face that was not quite sad and not quite happy, but something in between that he did not have a word for yet? He would get a word for it eventually. He was the kind of child who always did. Josephine built a life that surprised her with its fullness. She taught reading and penmanship at Margaret's informal school. She wrote petitions on behalf of the village's working families, for fair mill wages, for safer working conditions at the harbour, for the repair of the road that had been broken since the flood of 1869 and never properly mended. She had a gift for letters that cut through every excuse and went straight to the obligation, and slowly, one petition at a time, things in Westmere Cove began to improve. She also helped establish St. Anne's Academy, a small free school for children of the harbour and mill families who could not afford fees. It ran out of the old chapel hall on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and Josephine taught reading on Tuesdays, and Margaret taught arithmetic on Thursdays, and Percy Bramble donated bread every week with the solemnity of a man making a significant charitable endowment. Education. Percy had announced at the school's founding, with the authority of someone who had once read a book to the end, is the only thing a person can carry out of a burning house. Arthur attended every lesson. He also routinely attempted to improve them, which his mother found both charming and exhausting in equal measure. He was 5 now. He stood at her hip and asked her difficult things, while she was trying to cook, clean, and hold the whole shape of their life in her hands. "Who is my father?" She had known the question was coming. She had been preparing for it the way you prepare for a winter, knowing it will arrive, trying to stock enough warmth in advance. "He is a man who made a mistake," she said carefully. "Did he say sorry?" "Not yet." "Then he should." "Yes," she agreed, turning back to the fire. "He should." Arthur considered this for a moment. Then he went back to his wooden horse and apparently filed the information away for future use. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mind. It was, Josephine thought, possibly the most dangerous combination in England. Stirling Court had never been a quiet house, but it had become a silent one. There is a difference. Quiet is a house at rest. Silent is a house holding its breath. Sebastian Sterling moved through his estate like a man walking a route he had memorized but no longer wished to travel. He held every meeting. He signed every document. He stood at the head of every dinner table. He appeared, on all external evidence, to be functioning. But the portrait of Josephine that had hung in the east hallway had been taken down. By his mother's order, he was told, as it was felt to be distasteful. He had let it be taken. He was not sure, now, why he had not stopped it. There were a number of things from those early months that he could not explain to himself clearly. Vivienne pressed him to marry Lady Juliet Ashford, the eldest daughter of the Earl of Fenwick, and a perfectly sensible, perfectly elegant woman who had done nothing wrong and deserved considerably better than to be offered to a man still haunted by a wife he had cast out in the rain. Sebastian refused, month after month, without fully understanding why. "The estate requires an heir," Vivienne said, at the beginning of every quarter. "The estate requires better management of its accounts," Sebastian replied, at the beginning of every quarter. And that, it turned out, was the thread. Mr. Rupert Blackwell, the family solicitor, had been retained by Sebastian's late father with a particular brief that if any irregularity was ever found in the Sterling estate accounts, he was to investigate quietly and without interference. It was an unusual clause, written into a private codicil, as though the late Duke had suspected something and chosen not to say so aloud. Blackwell had been watching the accounts for 8 months when he found the first discrepancy, then another, then a pattern, a careful, clever, long-running pattern of redirected funds, wages never paid, provisions never purchased, payments made to shell names that traced, eventually, through several careful steps, to coastal properties. One of those properties was a disused mill in a village called Westmere Cove. Blackwell brought this to Sebastian in the autumn of 1875. Sebastian listened without speaking for 30 minutes. Then he said he would travel to Westmere Cove himself. Vivienne told him the journey was unnecessary. Sebastian went anyway. It was the first decision in 5 years that felt entirely his own. Sebastian's carriage arrived in Westmere Cove on a Tuesday morning in October, which happened to be the same morning that Arthur Wells had been sent to Mr. Bramble's bakery to collect a loaf of bread and a quarter-pound of currants for the St. Anne's Academy Tuesday lesson. The carriage came around the corner of Harbour Lane at a speed that scattered the market stalls, sent 3 chickens into a spectacular panic, and caused Percy Bramble to drop an entire tray of pastries while making a declaration that was fortunately lost beneath the noise. Arthur, who had been walking in the middle of the road because he was 5 and the road belonged equally to everyone, did not move. He looked at the carriage, he looked at the horses, he looked at the driver, who was telling him in urgent terms to stand aside. Arthur decided he had been startled and was therefore owed an apology before he moved anywhere. Sebastian stepped out onto the road with the contained irritation of a man whose carriage had been halted by what appeared to be a small child in a patched coat and wholly insufficient footwear. "You there, move aside." Arthur looked up at him. "Your horses came round that corner too fast. You frightened Mrs. Fenn's chickens. She'll be cross about that for the rest of the week." Sebastian opened his mouth, and then the boy looked directly at him. Grey-blue eyes, clear and unwavering, and entirely, devastatingly familiar. Every word that Sebastian had been preparing went out of him like air from a punctured thing. He stared. The boy stared back with the calm self-possession of someone who had absolutely no idea what he was doing to the man in front of him. "You are a very grand man," Arthur said, examining Sebastian's coat with the frank assessment of a child who has been taught to notice things, with very poor road manners. Percy Bramble, watching from the bakery doorway with a cloth in one hand and an expression of pure delight, turned away, and made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was definitely a laugh. Sebastian crouched down, an action that seemed to surprise both himself and everyone watching, and looked at the boy's face, the shape of the jaw, the line of the nose, the eyes that were so completely, impossibly his own. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Arthur," the boy said. "Arthur Wells." The surname landed on Sebastian like cold water. Not Sterling, Wells, which meant she had hidden him, which meant she had been here, which meant she was, possibly, still here. "Whose son are you, Arthur?" Arthur picked up his bread from where he had set it against the wall, tucked it under his arm, and regarded Sebastian with the sort of expression usually reserved for questions that should be obvious. "I am my mother's son," he said, with absolute finality, and walked away. Sebastian stood in the middle of Harbour Lane in Westmere Cove and did not move for what felt like a very long time. Sebastian followed at a distance, not closely enough to frighten the child, just close enough to know which direction led to her. The answer was the old chapel building at the top of Wren Street, which had a hand-painted board outside it reading, "St. Anne's Academy, open to all children, Tuesday and Thursday mornings." He stood at the gate for a moment. Then he pushed it open. He saw her through the window before she saw him. She stood at the front of the room, a slate board behind her, a piece of chalk in her hand, speaking to 6 children of assorted sizes, who were all watching her with the focused attention that very good teachers inspire, without trying. Her dark hair was pinned simply. She wore a deep blue dress with a white collar, practical, neat, nothing elaborate. She looked nothing like the Duchess of Sterling. She looked like herself, more completely, more quietly herself than he had ever seen her at Sterling Court. He did not go in immediately. He could not. He stood at the window and watched her explain a sentence on the board, watched her listen to a child's halting answer, watched her nod and say something that made the child sit straighter, and understood, in a way that was both new and very old, exactly what he had done. Arthur came in through the side door, set the bread on the table, announced that there had been a man with poor road manners outside, and went to take his seat. Josephine looked up. She saw Sebastian at the window. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she said something quiet to Margaret Holloway, who was knitting in the corner, with the unhurried calm of a woman who had seen a great many things arrive unexpectedly at her door, and came outside. She closed the door behind her. She stood 3 feet from him on the stone path, and he saw that she was composed and straight-backed, and that it had cost her something to become that way, and that she was not going to let him know how much. "Josephine! Sebastian!" Her voice gave him nothing. No warmth, no bitterness, no invitation. Just his name, returned to him, factual as a receipt. "I have been searching." "Have you?" "There are matters, serious matters, concerning the estate accounts. I need to speak with you about." "Is that why you are here?" It was not a question. He understood that. "Is he mine?" he asked. She looked at him for a long, unblinking moment. "You lost the right to ask that question," she said, "on the night you chose pride over truth." She went back inside. She closed the door. Sebastian stood on the path in the autumn cold and thought about 5 years, about empty hallways and taken-down portraits, and a marriage he had dismantled on the word of a woman he should have questioned, and the evidence of letters he had never once asked to be properly examined. He thought about a boy with grey-blue eyes who had called him a man with poor road manners. He thought, with a clarity that arrived very late and very complete, that Josephine was right. He had not earned the right to that question yet. He needed to earn it. Sebastian did not leave Westmere Cove. He sent his carriage and driver back to Sterling Court with a letter for Blackwell, instructing him to bring everything, every document, every ledger trace, every piece of evidence collected, to Westmere Cove within the week. He took rooms at the village inn. He ate Percy Bramble's bread for breakfast, which Percy accepted as a considerable honor and announced to at least 15 people. And he began to investigate properly. the way he should have done 5 years ago, with a different set of letters and a much simpler question. Clara Pembroke came first. He had written to her at Sterling Court, carefully, privately, and she had travelled down within 4 days. She arrived at the village inn with a letter she had kept folded inside her Bible for 5 years, too frightened to send and too honest to destroy. She sat across from Sebastian and told him everything. She described the evening Vivian's footman had come to her room. She described the afternoon she had, under pressure and against every instinct she possessed, placed the velvet box containing the necklace behind Josephine's writing desk, as instructed. She described the man who had delivered the forged letters to Graves, a courier she had seen before, a man she later understood was employed by a business associate of Vivian's. "I should have come forward at once," she told Sebastian. Her hands were steady on the table, but her voice was not. "I know that. I have known it every day since. I am sorry, Your Grace. I am sorry for what I did not do." Sebastian did not offer her easy absolution, because it was not his to give. But he told her the truth would be heard now, and that she would be protected for telling it. Blackwell arrived 2 days later with a travelling trunk of documents and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to be useful in exactly this way. What he had found, pieced together across 18 months of careful examination, was this. Vivian Sterling had, for at least 12 years, been redirecting portions of the estate's charitable and wages funds through a network of shell interests. The money had gone into coastal properties and a private investment portfolio held under a name that was not hers, but traced unambiguously back to her. The funds were not small. The mill workers of the Sterling estate had been underpaid for over a decade. Families had gone cold and hungry on wages that existed only in the cleaned version of the ledger. When Josephine had found the discrepancy and written to Blackwell, Vivian had found out within 48 hours. The framing of Josephine had not been a spontaneous cruelty. It had been a prepared one. Percy Bramble, who had been listening with rapidly increasing indignation to pieces of this story via his friendship with Blackwell's temporary clerk, came forward with something no one had thought to ask him for. He had seen a sealed messenger arriving at the coastal cottage 3 weeks before Josephine's expulsion. He had seen the messenger's livery. He had noted the colors because they were the same colors as a uniform he had once seen at Sterling Court, and he had a baker's particular memory for things that arrived and departed from a place. Lady Juliet Ashford, who had by now received a discreet letter from Sebastian explaining the full situation, made a decision that cost her nothing she wished to keep. She wrote back and said she had suspected Vivian's motives for the proposed marriage for some time, that she had her own evidence of conversations in which Vivian had spoken of needing to control the estate's legal heir situation before a certain solicitor became too curious. Juliet had kept notes. She was that kind of woman. The picture was now complete, and Vivian was still at Sterling Court, planning the charity ball. The Sterling Court Winter Charity Ball was a tradition of 40 years standing. It was the occasion on which the Sterling family opened the manor's grand ballroom to the county's finest families, made announcements of significance, and demonstrated, through sheer magnificence of setting and refreshments, that the family remained exactly as it had always been, powerful, graceful, and above reproach. Vivian had planned this year's event with particular care. She intended to announce Sebastian's engagement to Lady Juliet Ashford. She had already ordered the flowers. She had already informed the county's gossip columns, off the record, as a favor, that a delightful announcement was expected. She stood in the ballroom that evening, in silver and black, her pearls bright at her throat, and received her guests with the serene authority of a woman who has arranged everything. She had not received confirmation that Sebastian had arrived. She had not, in fact, received any letter from him in 11 days. The first sign that the evening would not go as arranged was when the ballroom doors opened at 9:20, and the guests near the entrance went quiet in that particular rippling way that means someone has entered who was not expected. Josephine Winthrop Sterling walked into Sterling Court for the first time in 5 years. She wore deep burgundy, simply cut, with no jewelry except for a single strand of amber her mother had left her. Her dark hair was dressed and pinned. She was calm in the way that people become calm when they have decided, absolutely, that the time for enduring in silence is finished. Beside her walked Mrs. Margaret Holloway, upright and formidable in grey wool. Behind them came Mr. Rupert Blackwell, carrying a leather document case, Clara Pembroke, pale but steady, and Mr. Percy Bramble, who had dressed for the occasion in his finest coat and was trying very hard not to look as though he found the whole thing enormously exciting. Sebastian was already inside. He stood near the fireplace, the same fireplace by which Vivian had poisoned the story 5 years ago. And when Josephine entered, he did not cross to her immediately. He waited, because she had not asked him to come to her, and he had learned, in the past 2 weeks, that there were things he needed to stop doing before being asked. Vivian saw Josephine and went very still. The second sign was when Arthur came in, holding Margaret's hand, wearing a new coat that was precisely the right size and had been acquired by Sebastian without fanfare 3 days earlier. He looked around the ballroom with the bright, assessing attention of a child who finds everything interesting. He found Vivian immediately. Children always find the person in a room who does not want to be looked at. Blackwell cleared his throat. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to, because the room had already gone quiet, and he said that he had a matter of estate record to present to the assembled company, at the request of his client, Lady Josephine Winthrop Sterling, as was his professional obligation, and the fulfillment of an instruction left to him by the late Duke of Sterling. He opened his case. He presented, first, the forged letters and the evidence of forgery, a comparison of Josephine's actual hand against the letters, prepared by a document expert, demonstrating the differences in seal impression, ink composition, and letter formation. He presented the ledger evidence, the 12 years of diverted funds, the shell names, the coastal properties, the mill wages never paid. He presented Clara's full testimony, witnessed and signed. He presented Percy's witness statement about the messenger. He presented Lady Juliet's letter, and finally, he presented a document from the late Duke of Sterling, a private codicil to the family deed, signed and sealed 11 years ago, which stated, in the precise and permanent language of law, that Lady Josephine Winthrop Sterling, as wife of the Duke, held full and equal rights of residence, title, and legal standing in the Sterling estate, and that any attempt to remove those rights without full and transparent legal process would be treated as fraud against the estate. Vivian had not known about that document. The room was very quiet. Arthur let go of Margaret's hand and walked to the center of the room with the unhurried confidence of a 5-year-old who has been raised to believe that difficult things should be said clearly and in good English. He looked at Sebastian. "My mother says you made a mistake." Sebastian looked down at his son. "She is right," he said. "Did you know it was a mistake when you made it?" The room held its breath. Even Percy Bramble held his. "No," Sebastian said honestly. "Is that why you did not say sorry sooner?" "Yes, and because I was too proud, and because I was afraid, neither of which is a good reason." Arthur considered this for a moment. "My mother says sorry should always come before excuses. Your mother is right about that too. She usually is." Someone in the crowd made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly a sob. Percy Bramble did not bother to pretend it was not him. Vivian was escorted from the ballroom by the magistrate and 2 constables who had been quietly invited for the purpose. She left without a scene. It was the only composure she had left to maintain. She would face charges on multiple counts: fraud against the estate, conspiracy to defraud, and the deliberate framing of an innocent person. The legal process would take months. The outcome was not in doubt. She did not look at Josephine as she left. Josephine watched her go, with no expression of triumph on her face, because she had learned, across 5 difficult years, that justice is not the same as revenge. Justice restores. Revenge only continues the wound. Sebastian crossed the ballroom. He stood before Josephine and did not speak immediately, because there was no sentence large enough for what he needed to say, and he was, at last, wise enough to know it. He did what he had not done on the night of the rain. He knelt. I cannot give you back the 5 years. I cannot undo the rain. I cannot change the night I chose my pride over the woman who deserved every bit of my trust. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am asking you to allow me to spend however long it takes, however long you need, proving that I know, now, who you are and what I threw away. Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "Get up, Sebastian," she said, quietly. "A duke kneeling at a charity ball will be in every newspaper in the county by Thursday." He stood, and she saw, for the first time in 5 years, something in his eyes that was not judgment. It was the warmth that had once made her fall in love with him. "I am not ready to forgive you," she said, "but I am willing to let you try." Arthur reappeared at her side, slid his hand into hers, and looked up at both of them. "Are we staying?" Josephine looked at the house around her, the house that had closed its doors on her, the house her son had a legal right to, the house that had been built and betrayed, and might now, slowly, be made honest. "For tonight," she said, "we will see about the rest." Vivian Sterling was found guilty on all charges. She was removed permanently from Sterling Court and stripped of all estate authority. Her private properties, the ones purchased with stolen funds, were seized and liquidated. A significant portion of those funds were returned to the mill workers' families as back payment of wages owed. It took 2 years to distribute it all. Blackwell managed every payment personally, and not a single name was missed. Clara Pembroke received a formal letter of apology from Sebastian, and a settlement that secured her brother's apprenticeship and set her up with the independence she should always have had. She eventually became Margaret Holloway's assistant at St. Anne's Academy. Anne's Academy received a full endowment from the Sterling estate, enough to operate properly, hire permanent teachers, and expand into a second room. It would educate 3 generations of Westmere Cove children. Mr. Percy Bramble became the official supplier of all baked goods to Sterling Court events, a distinction he accepted with tears in his eyes and immediately printed on his shop sign. He also became the primary source of news in Westmere Cove for the remainder of his natural life, a role he had, in truth, always occupied. Lady Juliet Ashford, freed from the arranged engagement, eventually found happiness with a quiet academic from Oxford who valued her sharp mind and her excellent notes. She and Josephine remained friends for the rest of their lives. Arthur Sterling was formally recognized as the legitimate son and heir of Duke Sebastian Sterling, with full legal standing, and the name he had always deserved. He was delighted about the name. He was less delighted about having to learn new handwriting for correspondence. Sebastian did not rush Josephine. He visited. He wrote. He was present for Arthur. He asked for nothing and offered what was needed and made no demands of love he had not re-earned. It took time. There was one evening, 8 months later, in the garden of the cottage in Westmere Cove, while Arthur slept and the sea was quiet and the stars came out one by one over the water, when Josephine sat beside Sebastian on the old stone bench, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and then she rested her head against his shoulder, just slightly, as though testing the weight of something she had put down for years and was considering whether to pick back up. He did not move. He barely breathed. He understood that this was the most important thing he had ever been trusted with. She forgave him, not all at once, and not without conditions, and not without the clear understanding that certain things had changed between them and would stay changed. But she forgave him in the way that real forgiveness works, not as a gate that opens and closes, but as a door that has been unlocked and stands open in the light. They were married again, quietly, in the chapel of Westmere Cove, with Margaret and Percy and Clara as witnesses, and Arthur as the sole and extremely opinionated ring-bearer. "I would like to make a speech," Arthur announced. "Not today," said Josephine. "Tomorrow, then. We'll discuss it. He made the speech. It was excellent. Percy wept. Stirling Court was not the same place Josephine had left. Under Sebastian's changed management, and eventually under Arthur's bright, demanding, relentless attention, it became something it had never been before. A house where the people who worked on the estate were treated as the reason for the estate's existence, not its decoration. The mill workers received their wages properly. The road was fixed. The children of the village went to school. The portrait of Josephine was rehung in the east hallway, and Lady Josephine Winthrop Sterling received, at last, the happiness she had earned. Not because a door was opened for her, but because she had built a life of extraordinary courage in the years when it was closed. She had been thrown into the rain. She had walked through it. And when the sun finally came, it came all the way. Noble viewers, before the final page is turned upon the story of Stirling Court, before we part ways for this evening, allow me one sincere moment. If Josephine's courage moved you, if Arthur's boldness made you smile, if Sebastian's long road back to truth reminded you that it is never too late to choose honesty over pride, then this story has done what it came to do. And now I ask you to do something in return. Subscribe to Forbidden Palace, leave a like upon this video, and in the comments tell me, should Josephine have forgiven Sebastian, or should she have chosen a peaceful life without him? I read every word you write, and I will reply. Because this is not just a channel, it is a community, built word by word, story by story, one noble viewer at a time. Subscribe to see how the next story unfolds, and comment where you are watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Thank you, from the very heart of Forbidden Palace. And so Stirling Court stood, at last, under clear skies. Vivian, who had governed that house through manipulation for 30 years, lost every instrument of that power, the title, the authority, the long performance of grace that had never been grace at all. Those who had helped her were dismissed. Those who had been harmed by her were restored. The lie she had constructed with such care, the forged letters, the planted necklace, the framing of an innocent woman, was dismantled in one evening before the very society she had always performed for. Clara, who had once been too frightened to tell the truth, was given the chance to live bravely. Percy, who had seemed only comic relief, turned out to be exactly the witness the truth needed. Margaret, who had offered a stranger shelter in the rain, watched the daughter she had helped raise walk back into the world she deserved. And Sebastian received the hardest consequence of all, the knowledge that everything he had lost by his own choosing. Not by treachery, not by fate, not by the cruelty of the world, by his own unwillingness, in one terrible moment, to protect the woman he loved more than he valued his own certainty. That knowledge never fully left him. He carried it as an honest man carries the record of his worst mistake, not as a wound to reopen, but as a reminder to stay better. Arthur Sterling grew up to become a man who asked questions before forming verdicts, who examined evidence before accepting accusations, who understood, because his mother had taught him and his father's story had shown him, that judgment without proof destroys the innocent, while silence in the face of injustice destroys everyone. The rain that once carried Josephine into the cold and dark became, in time, the rain of a different night. The night Arthur asked his father to teach him to read the ledgers, and Sebastian sat beside his son at the desk that had once held those forged letters and showed him every line and said, "Every number represents a person. Never forget that." "I won't," said Arthur. He never did. And Lady Josephine Winthrop Sterling, sitting by the window of the east drawing-room, with the lamp low and the coast wind quiet outside, heard their voices through the open door, her son's bright questions, her husband's careful answers, and felt something settle in her that had been moving for 5 long years. Not relief, not triumph, peace, the kind that is only given to those who have earned it the hard way. Moral and educational lessons. 1. Judgment without evidence destroys innocent lives. Sebastian chose to believe forged letters without investigation. He had every resource to verify the truth, and chose instead to act on emotion and pride. The story shows us that accusations, however convincingly presented, must be examined before they are acted upon. This applies in families, workplaces, and communities. 2. Silence in the face of injustice carries its own cost. Clara knew the truth and said nothing. That silence was a weight she carried alone. The story teaches that speaking truth, especially when it is costly and frightening, is an act of courage that protects the innocent and ultimately restores the one who speaks it. 3. Education is the foundation that cannot be taken from you. Josephine survived and rebuilt because she had knowledge, skill in writing and letters, and the ability to advocate through words. Anne's Academy showed the difference that access to education makes for children born without advantage. A community that educates its children invests in its own future.